Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Grand Page. I am your most humble and obedient servant, Page Ghost. I've debated doing this video for a while, and I've come to the ultimate conclusion that if I don't make this video, no one else will. I feel like a lot of people are talking about the Rippaverse on two very extreme ends. They either absolutely hate it or they absolutely love it. And I feel like maybe I can bring sort of a more middle ground perspective. Although, probably by the end of this video, you'll probably align me more so with the critical side than the positive side. I hope, though, that you'll see my critiques and also my positive associations with the Rippaverse either way. How I want to approach this video is not necessarily going a deep dive into each story, its particulars, things of that nature. I want to talk more from the business and creative side of things. Things that I think are much more problematic than necessarily the stories and characters themselves, because I think if those creative and business decisions were improved upon, I feel like the stories overall would not be as much of a focus, and there would be not as many problems with the Rippaverse. But with all that kind of being said, I want to go through all the books that have come out, and we're going to be paying particular attention to the books that have come out this past year, this current year, 2025, because that's where a lot of the issues kind of started first, being much more noticeable. But I also want to get into sort of the signals along the way that showed the potential problems. So with all that being said, first, I usually hate it when people do this, but I feel like this is a little more important for me to do it here. So right there, it's probably going to show up as upside down, but you can see there that I have gotten every book from the Rippaverse so far. At least the ones that have shipped out. I have backed every book of the Rippaverse since the start, and even to this year, even some of the books that I was less enthused about, and we're going to talk a little bit about that and why I was less interested in those. But I was a big support. I am actually still a big supporter of Young Rippa. I like a lot of his takes on politics, and I like a lot of his takes on the comics scene and things of that nature. I haven't agreed with him on everything. I feel like he has very extreme perspectives on a lot of stuff. But I enjoyed a lot of his content, and when he said he was going to be starting his own comic book company, I was very interested. And then ISOM #1 came out, and I got it, pretty much ordered it. I tried to order it day one, but as I'm sure many of us knew, he got a lot of traffic. A $3 million selling comic got a lot of internet traffic, and so I actually couldn't order it like when it first appeared online, and I probably got it like a day or so later. I was lucky enough to get this cover A. I'm very, very happy about that, because this was easily the best cover that he put out for his comic. And I said back then, I have a video on it where I go basically step by step through the book, and I thought it was good. I thought it was a good entry point, and a lot of people criticized it for ISOM not being sort of this more traditional hero. I had no problems with that. I wasn't banking on the Rippaverse because necessarily they were all going to be, these shining examples of heroism. I was interested in what the story was going to be, and starting out, it was fine. They established that this is later on in ISOM's life, and that he stopped the hero gig, and he doesn't really act like a hero in this book at all. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's totally fine, because this is the beginning of this current iteration of Isom. Obviously, he's gone through some character changes, and we get to see those character changes, and it's totally fine that he kind of goes unhinged, so to speak. And it was a very simple story. It didn't need to be anything earth shattering. It didn't need to be some sort of grand stakes. His sister calls in a personal favor, and his sister calls in a personal favor, and they try to. He goes to help out a girl, and get help for her who's being likely misused or abused or manipulated. There we go. There's a word. Manipulated by someone he knows to be of not good stature. Fontano. So it was fine that he was violent and that he wasn't necessarily on the right side. It was establishing the kind of character he was. That's totally okay. However, I think the real issues started to appear in the creative decisions when the second book came out. And I like Isom number 1 and I like Isom number 2. But these books really do not go together at all. There is no continuance of the inciting incident from Isom number 1. These were advertised as this sort of ill-advised arc, and there were going to be 3 parts. This could easily be looked at as a completely different story because Fontana barely shows up. I think he's like at the beginning and he slaps Isom's sister, and then he's very quickly kicked out. But Isom goes on a completely different adventure, and we're introduced to more interesting characters, and that's fine. But this almost has nothing to do with the story that was established in Isom number 1. And this was my first sort of signal that I got of there are some creative issues here. Now again, this was his second book ever, and so I didn't expect perfection from the first, second, or even third or fourth or fifth books. I didn't ever expect perfection from any of this because creation is an art and it's very difficult to execute. But this is when sort of the signals first started firing off of what's really going on here creatively, and there's a lot of disjointedness. And so moving on, we get to Alpha Core number 1, and this is the first book that was not necessarily Alpha Core was obviously created by Eric July, but the book itself was written by Chuck Dixon. So it was sort of this collaborative team between Eric July and Chuck Dixon, where Eric July sort of established things and then Chuck Dixon sort of fleshed them out. I think that's a good way of putting it. And I'll go ahead and say that easily the Chuck Dixon books are the better books of Rippaverse, and that's not necessarily a bad thing because there's a similar situation with like Marvel Comics, DC Comics. Not every writer is as good as another writer. I've heard criticisms of Alpha Core being like, shortened version is these are meant to symbolize characters like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, and they're supposed to fill these archetypes, but they're horrible people. That's not necessarily a problem. Just because a guy looks like Superman doesn't mean he's supposed to be Superman. It just means that he looks like Superman, and also looks like Superman. The closest thing with this is actually, funny enough, the hair on Brian Solari. I'm sure you can see there the little whip on his hair there. That's very similar to Superman's. But everything else, it's a very, very unique look. It's more militaristic and less superhero-y. And this isn't me saying that like they're some like great characters or anything either, but there was a very interesting moment in the Alpha Core story that when it hit the climax of the story, this one character was sort of struggling with his powers and how to use them, and I think her name is Ingrid. she ends up giving him a pep talk, and he ends up saving the day and giving his life. Like, that was a very good twist at the end. It was a bit of a stretch as far as him using his powers and how efficiently he was able to do it, but it was still a very interesting piece to the story that I thought was very well rounded. So again, nothing so far in these first three books that was like super stellar, amazing. Nothing in the Rippaverse is going to stand the test of time yet, I would argue, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily a problem. It just means that these characters might embody certain symbolisms, certain archetypes, but Eric July and his creative team does their own things with them, and that's fine. So next we get to Yara number one, and I would actually argue that this is probably the first interesting book, and it gets a lot more in depth with the character because it's a very personal story for Yara herself. She's dealing with sort of past trauma. It's been out for a little while now, so I don't think it's going to be too much of a spoiler. But Yara is essentially an alien. She comes from another planet, and she's either some kind of immortal or something else along those lines. I'm not exactly sure what, but she certainly lives long because she came to Earth back like during the Viking times. And she like watched her old family die and all this other stuff. And it's a very personal story where she's trying to reconnect with her family lineage that she started on Earth while also evading this sort of crime unit from her planet. But getting into that sort of aspect of how we're not really sure exactly who she is, what she is, that sort of thing, that seems to also be a recurring problem in the Rippaverse as far as creatively speaking. And that is, nothing seems to be super defined. What I mean by that is, even now, after the third book for Isom has come out, we still don't get a clear idea of powers, capabilities, limits, how those limits can be stretched, that sort of thing. And again, that's not necessarily a problem. You don't necessarily want to give all the answers to your audience because you want them to kind of figure it out on their own a little bit. You want them to have questions, especially starting out like this. But how many books is this now? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We're like 11, 12 books in, and still a lot of things are left to interpretation. And that's not good because then everyone's talking about different characters. A really, really good example of this actually is with my first business and creative problem from the Rippaverse. So we go back to Isom number one for a second. This is the first printing of Isom number one. And Eric July released a remastered edition of Isom number one in his Trinity collection. And in that Trinity collection, he makes some changes to the Isom story. Specifically, actually, I'm going to show you because it's such a big deal. It's so important what happened here. But he makes a really big change in that Trinity volume. Here we go. Oh, this is going to be hard to see because I really don't want to bend this, but it'll be all right. So, you see there, Isom punching a guy and blood going everywhere. That's this version of the story. And for a while, that was the version of the story that everybody got. But then the Trinity volume comes out, and all that blood splatter, the color was changed to this weird hyper-violet blue color, suggesting more of an energy blast. If that is someone's introduction to Isom, that is a completely different Isom from the character that I was introduced to, or from anyone else who read that first comic. And now we're getting into not even just different interpretations, but we're getting into actual different characterizations. The Isom from my comic is completely different from the Isom in the Trinity volume, because the Trinity volume would suggest a certain superpower, whereas the first comic over here suggests a completely different superpower. And there's inconsistency in the storytelling. And we were told from the start that there would always be consistency. I don't care if Isom had an energy blast from his fist, and I don't care if he punched a guy's liver out, but I care that both of these stories exist at the same time. Because we don't know what Isom can do now. And it doesn't seem like anyone wants to define his powers. And I don't think it's about... I don't think the lack of definition is because they want to let people have fun with the characters. It feels like it's more about not wanting to be put into a creative box. But the thing is, as you continue to develop these stories, the lack of a box becomes a problem. It's fine early on if you're still kind of figuring things out, but once you establish something, you need to go with that. It was established in Amazing Spider-Man, or Amazing Fantasy, that Spider-Man did not make his own web fluid. And to this day, at least in that particular continuity of Spider-Man, he still has to make his web fluid. Because of that consistency. Now you can write a story where, he gets additional powers and stuff like that. We saw that with Spider-Man Other, where, for example, they never really did much with it, unfortunately, but it would have been really cool, where Spider-Man, could use the hairs on his back, like an actual spider, to help stick someone to his back so that way he could use both his hands and still carry somebody, right? So, they changed the continuity a little bit, but they changed it with a story, not suddenly in this new volume of the story. That was my first really big red flag with Rippaverse, creatively, all that stuff. And there's this lack of definition with characters and their abilities and where they come from and what they can do and all this other stuff. And it's going to be a huge problem as the Rippaverse continues to put out more books. All right, so moving on, we get to Gooding. This one I was very excited for, and I enjoyed it too. I might put it on par with Yaira. Maybe it was a little down in quality from Yaira, but I really liked Gooding, and it was our first real kind of origin story where we actually start at the beginning of Gooding's life, how he became sort of this protector for hire, and all that was really interesting, and the villain was pretty cool too. And they got Mike Barron to write the story. He's done Punisher and stuff like that, so I was also really excited for that as well. And this was the first book that Eric July put out that didn't seem to have the same hype behind it. These first 4 books, Isom 1 and 2, Alpha Core, and Yaira, they all made like $1 million. This was the first one that made under $1 million, and it was significantly less than $1 million. I don't remember the exact numbers because, again, problem, there's no clear, there's not a lot of transparency with finance numbers. I think you can get the final sales for this still on their website or on some of their social media posts or something. But this was the first Rippaverse book that really didn't do the same numbers as the other one. But I do think that Young Rippa put it out more as a kind of test. Like, hey, all the other characters were really built up. It was the start of the company. What happens if I put something out that's a little less, expected? And I think he saw that it still did pretty well. And I'm glad too, because I was glad to see Gooding. Again, it wasn't anything amazing. I don't think many of these characters, if any, will necessarily stand the test of time, but I wasn't necessarily looking for that. I was just looking for a decent story. And then after Gooding, we get the Horseman. And yes, you're supposed to say the Horseman. I, I'm Christian, I'm Catholic, and we have that story of the apocalypse with the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and so I was very familiar with that, and so I knew to say the Horseman. But I also understand that people's experience with comic book characters, you say Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, and so there's that temptation to say the Horseman, and then that sounds weird. But I do think it's meant to be said Horseman. And this one was completely created by Chuck Dixon and Joe Bennett. They are the guys who came up with the character, and Eric July greenlit it. And this is sort of where we get into my next problem creatively with the Rippaverse. We're getting to the point where really none of these characters are superheroes. While I had no problem that Isom was no superhero, or even necessarily Alpha Core, weren't necessarily superheroes. We're several characters in, and there's no one that is worth looking up to in this universe. And I think that is a problem. Everyone seems to have some kind of angle for what they do. Isom's getting back into the hero business because of the slight from Fontano. Alpha Core, admittedly, are trying to work with the police, but they also still make their own decisions and they don't run anything by the police. Yaira is very much doing things for herself, making her own decisions for herself. She's on a very personal journey, and that's interesting. And you kind of root for her with that, but she's still making decisions for herself and not for the better of others. Gooding is a character that does good things if you're willing to pay. And then the Horseman is probably the closest to sort of this aspirational hero. But the problem with him is that he also does it for the paycheck. Because he uses the money that he takes from these criminals, and it's basically his paycheck. Oh, I stopped these criminals, so I get to keep the money that they illegally had. There's a bit of a gray area there, but he's still not really operating in an aspirational sense. He's not doing good because it's good. He's kind of doing it because I can't get a real job. That's sort of the essence of it. And so that's where we're getting at creatively there. And so these creative problems are just piling up where there's no aspirational heroes, and there's inconsistency in the lore, and we were promised that wouldn't be a thing, and these creative problems are piling up, and business decisions are being made that just aren't very, very well reflected. Then we get to Bloodruth. I got the black and white edition. They marketed this as a horror story, very interesting. The first sort of horror story in the Rippaverse. Decent read. I liked Bloodruth's introduction, and after you finally get an idea of her powers are very interesting. She uses her blood to create sort of magic projections and things like that. Not projections, maybe that's not the right term, but like magic blasts and things like that. I like that symbolism of power and blood, life and blood, that sort of thing. The ending was a bit weird. The The start of the story was clear enough, and the family lineage is very interesting. The biblical ties and all of that was very interesting. I did have to be careful with this read. Again, I'm Catholic, and there's a lot of Christian stuff in here that's used. It's my same problem with things like Ghost Rider, where they want to acknowledge, or not acknowledge, they want to use uh, theological terminology and theological stories and things like that, specifically from Christianity. And they really, really, really want to use that bad side. They want to use demons, they want to use the devil and the occult and all that stuff, but they don't want to recognize the other side a whole lot. And I feel like it's a big problem whenever you tackle themes in this arena. For example, with Ghost Rider. And I know that over time they have addressed, particularly with Ghost Rider, that other side. But it wasn't always a thing. It's not really what most people talk about anyways. But I feel like it's a real problem that you want to talk about demons, you want to talk about the devil, you want to talk about all these problems, but then the obvious solution that's there, if you include the whole theological debate, if that kind of makes sense. You don't want to include God in there essentially, but you want to have the devil in there. Fine, whatever. But this is where the creative and business problems really start to show up. The infamous broken up double page spread. The infamous broken up double page spread. In his video that Eric July put out, he specifically said, "I may have messed up a little bit." And then as the video goes on, he tries to play it off like it was an intentional mistake. I don't know, this double page spread, I've seen it, obviously, because I have the book and I read it, and if I can find it real quick. It doesn't work. It doesn't, because he makes it out to be this sort of grand reveal, but all you see is a woman being taken apart, and then on the other side you see 2/3 of a demon, his name, and a bloody arm. There's something to be said about breaking conventional storytelling conventions, breaking typical storytelling conventions. There's something to be said about that, to see where something goes. And if it had been more clearly that, maybe then that would have been legitimate. But I'm sorry, no, that was not an intentional mistake. That was not a creative decision. They messed up the double page spread, and they sent the book out anyways. That's what happened. Like, you can't convince me otherwise. And we'll get more into that whenever we get to Zaylin. On that negative note, though, Great War of Separation #1. I think this is the first really good book from the Rippaverse. And it's sort of this origin story, if I'm not mistaken, for Xeps. The story isn't done yet. There's still 2 more books to come out for it. But this is, I would argue, this is probably the best book that the Rippaverse has put out. I really, really liked Great War of Separation. People tried to pass it off as a Texas fan fiction, right? The Texas breaking off from the United States. But it's actually not that simple. And in fact, it's much more detailed than that, and it's a really good inciting incident that starts creating the problem. And we get background on Isom, and we get background on Brian Solari. I actually, like, again, I don't think this is going to necessarily stand the test of time, but like, if you've been on the fence about the Rippaverse, I would actually recommend Great War of Separation. It's really far removed from the rest of the Rippaverse because it's this kind of origin story for a lot of it, and yeah, I definitely recommend Great War of Separation. Yaira number two. This was fine, significantly shorter than the previous one. Not nearly as much personal stakes as before. It really felt more like a preview for Yaira number three. Sort of this. There you go. It's like a free comic book day book. You don't really need it, but it can give you a little bit of context and lead up for what's about to come out. All right. Zaylin. My first problem with Zaylin. I don't know if that's because it's the mass print version of the book, but this does not have the same spine as most of the Rippaverse spines look like this. This one, again, I don't know if that's because of the this is the mass print, but whatever the case. One thing that I'm kind of grateful for, because I keep getting these books and they keep pumping out like 12 every other week, more and more of the mass print books have the better covers. And so I've been getting a lot of the mass print books, and so I'm actually kind of grateful for that. But Zaylin, this is where the misprint was actually admitted to. And it's fine if you have mistakes. There's nothing wrong with that. Some people have really tried to talk about how these mistakes are unacceptable and that sort of thing. Mistakes are fine. There's nothing wrong with mistakes. Is what you do in response to those mistakes. They catch the mistake as they're shipping this out, and they don't stop the shipping. They just say, if you ordered it, you're getting it. And then if you want your money back, you have to ship it back. You have to pay for that. And then the only other consolation is that you get 60% off any purchase. No, it should have been. You really needed to refund people. And I'll say I'll be fair and admit that the misprint is not super noticeable, especially for someone like me that I really don't open up my books very wide because I try to keep them as pristine as possible. So for someone like me, the misprint really isn't that noticeable. It is very faint, and so the misprint maybe was blown up out of proportion by other people. But a misprint's a misprint. If the book is going out in a form that was not intended, then it shouldn't be out there. Then you need to stop. You need to stop the presses. You need to stop sending them out and tell people, or if you're going to send them out, say, hey, you got a free book and you're going to get another one. And that's a real shame too, because this is another book that I wouldn't say it's as good as the Great War of Separation, but I'd say it's a step down. It's basically the top three books would probably be the Chuck Dixon books, Great War of Separation, Zaylin and the Horsemen, with Yaira / Gooding probably being up there too. This was also the first book that I noticed, so it seems to be very thick. But then I start flipping through the book, and the pages seem much thicker. Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, I was absolutely right. These pages are much thicker than previous books. So it gives the impression of a big story. But it's not as big as you might think. It's a typical Rippaverse length story. Okay, and then we get to Ice on Number 3. And this one is, I feel like it had a decent payoff at the end. There was a good twist for Jasmine. the lady that ISOM was trying to help out. A very interesting twist with that. But number one, I think Eric July knew that the events from ISOM 2 really didn't connect with the original story being told, because we pick up where ISOM number 2 left off, and then very quickly and jarringly get back on track from where we left off with ISOM number 1. So that was very jarring to pick up from there. And then we're introduced to this new term called peakers. And I said in my ISOM number 1 video that I wasn't a big fan of accepts, but I was willing to accept it. Haha, pun intended. But then we get introduced to peakers in this. And number 1, I don't think the word works. And number 2, to get further context on peakers, you need to read Great War of Separation number 2. It's not out yet. So that's just something that I can't get further context for, and so I feel like there's something I'm missing from ISOM number 3. So that's not good. So that's sort of a run through of each of the books, what I like about them, some dislikes that I like about them, or some likes, some dislikes, and then problems creatively and with the business side. To talk about some of the current decisions being made. The first book that was announced that I almost wanted nothing to do with, Saints and Sinners. Because I found out, as everybody did from the announcement, that the book is being written by like 5 or 6 different groups of people. And a lot of them are YouTubers. And the biggest letdown on that was Az. I can't stand heel versus babyface. I hated saying his name in the first place. When the Silverback joined Young Rippa on his podcast, the content tanked. Absolutely tanked. I can't watch Young Rippa anymore because it's half the time it's that guy, and I can't stand him. I just can't. I've tried watching his stuff before. I just can't do it. So I almost didn't buy the book just because he was on it. And then I didn't like the idea of a bunch of YouTubers being put on as authors when it kind of... So for me personally, the big thing was Az. And then there's this weird thing going on where it's like, what are you getting the book for? Oh, well, I got it because Critical Drinker wrote a story, or because Az wrote a story, or because Mahler wrote a story, or because Eric July wrote a story. And so it makes you wonder why people got the book. I got the book mainly because I used my 60% off coupon from Zalen with it. So maybe that kind of gave me that extra push to get it. But also I'm legitimately interested, or I was legitimately interested in that story with Ingrid until I found out Az wrote her story. So whatever interest I found in her is probably going to get lost now. But those sales we're getting for that book, how many of those sales are from different audiences? Who's helping to sell the book? Like, very clearly with books like Zalen, you either got it because you're a fan of the Rippaverse, and or because you're a Chuck Dixon fan. You got Yaira because you're a Rippaverse fan, or because you're a Saska Sisters fan, right? And so now you get a whole bunch of people buying this book because you're a Mahler fan, or because you're a Critical Drinker fan, or because you're an Az fan, or because you're a Rippaverse fan, and it muddies the waters of who's supporting these stories. And I feel like there's a problem with that. I want people in on this universe because it's an interesting universe and it's got interesting stories to tell and it's got interesting writers, and not because, oh, well, I like this guy, I watch his stuff. No, like, does he make good stuff? Well, I don't know. I don't know. All this to say, to kind of start bringing things to a close, because I've probably ranted long enough at this point. Oh, one final piece of business. I think it was a huge mistake for the Rippaverse going to like a book a month. I know I was hyperbolic before, but more realistically, he's putting out like a book a month or a book every other week or something like that. I think that was a huge mistake. Huge mistake. I think he really needed to rein it back and put out like 3 or 4 books a year, something like that. And he really needs to be less concerned about putting books out on time, because then you don't get Bloodruth misprint, you don't get the Zalen misprint. And it's like someone else has said before, those misprints went out because nobody looked at the books. If I was writing a story, I would read it before putting it out there. I'd make a story because I'm interested in reading it. If you don't have an interest in your own story, why are you putting it out there in the first place? So again, just to kind of start wrapping things up, I was very excited for where Rippaverse started. I don't know if I can keep supporting them. And I think after Great War of Separation number 3, I think I need to be done. I think that'll sort of round things off pretty well. I liked Great War of Separation number 1. I think number 2 will be good. And hopefully number 3 will have a satisfying conclusion. This isn't to say that you should stop supporting the Rippaverse. But it is to say that if you are a Rippaverse fan, you can't sit there and say that there aren't problems. There are very clear problems here that need to be addressed if Rippaverse wants to stand the test of time. Now, if it doesn't, if it just wants to keep putting out books and just get sales from it, fine. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But don't sit there and act like any of these characters are Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Spider-Man, Captain America. Those characters will likely stand the test of time. Characters like Achilles, characters like Odysseus. Those characters stood the test of time. The Marvel and DC characters will stand the test of time, but I'm sorry. As it stands right now, Rippaverse won't. And I think I need to be done with it at some point. So, please, if you agree with anything I've said, if you disagree with anything I've said, give it a like, give it a dislike, put your happy, mean, or, discussion comments down below. Certainly would like to see what you have to say about the Rippaverse or anything that I've said about it. As always, I am your most humble and obedient servant, Page Ghost.